So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the University of Vermont and the Davis Center. I'm Richard Galbraith. I'm the Vice President for Research here at the university. And you're going to hear, unfortunately, you're going to hear more from me later. But right now I wanted to introduce and welcome a special guest that we have tonight, Heather Boucher, the Secretary of Education for the state of Vermont, who would like to say a few words to us in connection with this study and what we're going to hear about later on. So help me welcome to the stage Heather.
Good evening, and thank you for that kind introduction. So I adjust my mic. I'm very happy to be here to provide opening remarks on behalf of the Agency of Education. As you know, in Vermont, I hope you know, our students do quite well in a variety of ways. We have some of the most immunized, health-insured, fittest kids in the nation. Academically, we have historically ranked, and still do currently, in the top 5 on the nation's report card, if you're not aware. Although there has been a recent performance decline in some of our statewide assessments that we're trying to stay on top of. These overall numbers, however, don't really tell the full story, as you likely know. Typically, underlying these broad state-level statistics and trends is significant variation in students' genetic contributions and lived experiences that lead to these kind of outcomes that I was just talking about. And that's why the ABCD study is so incredibly important, in my opinion. As a developmental psychologist by training, I'm thrilled at the scope of this national study. It promises to reveal cutting-edge findings using brain imaging, hormone analyses, and psychological assessment, to name just a few of the methodological features. And I understand that some of our participants and participating families, many of you maybe, are in the audience, and you probably know exactly what I'm talking about with this list then, if you've already participated. So thank you. And it's just as critical, I would argue, that this work has a longitudinal component, because what that does is really help disentangle what's due to individual variability and what's due to different experiences between groups of adolescents. The wealth of information on adolescent brain development alone will be an incredible leap forward, I feel, in our collective understanding. It's essential also that we have this large-scale study to adequately quantify effects and accordingly provide guidance to both parents and educators as a result of those findings. As a parent of a teen, an adolescent myself, I personally can't wait to hear what fresh new adventures await my family either. Perhaps most important to Vermont's educators, are there any educators in the room this evening? Yay! Be proud, yay, there's a few. This study also affords unique opportunity to see how variation in our educational practice helps grow healthy minds and healthy brains. For instance, we believe that physical education, arts, and mindfulness can all positively benefit our children, but quantitative evidence to date has been sorely lacking. This study will allow us to establish an evidence-based rationale for these particular educational initiatives and others. More specifically, we can assess the impact of particular instructional practices in Vermont and similar practices in other states and how they have an impact on adolescent development. Very important. This study is a great example of collaboration between educators and researchers, and specifically between local communities and UVM. As a former academic and researcher, applied researcher myself, I know how hard it is on families to get to do all of the work that is required of you, so thank you for sticking to the plan. I know it's much appreciated by the research team. It's also notable that there has been a tremendously high level of involvement and investment from Vermont superintendents, principals and teachers, and families. In fact, I understand that Vermont has the highest level of participation per school in the nation. Another reason why we should be proud of our small but mighty state. So on behalf of the Agency of Education, I want to thank the authors for bringing this research to Vermont and for committing themselves to such a worthy long-term endeavor, and for sharing with all of us tonight what are sure to be interesting contributions of this work so far.
So my job now is to introduce Hugh Garavan, but before I do that, I just want to emphasize, you'll hear a lot more from him about the details, but this study is utterly unique in the history of the world. Nobody has ever done a study like this. It's involving 21 different universities, and the goal is to recruit 10,000 individuals into this study. The scale of this is just bewildering compared to the kinds of experiments that many of us grew up doing on human subjects and volunteers, where typically you take 10 or 20 or 30 people and put them through some kind of procedure. The concept of doing 10,000 at all these multiple different sites and putting them together is a new way of doing research in the United States and indeed in the world. So I just want to emphasize how groundbreaking this is. One of the principal components of this study nationwide is my counterpart at San Diego, Sandra Brown, who's one of the people who's worked hard to put this together. And she has said some very complimentary things about the unit here in Vermont that's been responsible for this. The principal investigator here is Hugh Garavan, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in just a second, but I want to emphasize that this really does take a huge number of people working together to do all the work that's required for this study. So again, nationally we haven't seen anything like it, locally we haven't seen anything like it either. So Hugh was born in Ireland in a very small town, so small I couldn't find the name of it anywhere. He went to the National University of Ireland in Galway to study psychology, and then he came to the United States to Bowling Green State University, where he got an MA, and then in 1995 a PhD also in psychology. He has worked in several different institutions, both in Ireland and in the United States of America. He has found time to publish 222 manuscripts in journals, which is an astonishing number. And he's the glue and the driver for Vermont and the contribution for Vermont to the ABCD study. So unlike me, you'll notice that he has a sort of funny accent. So bear with him. It's kind of pleasant and lilting and lyrical, and I think you'll get used to it pretty quickly. Please come to the stage, Hugh Garavan.
So actually, thank you very much, everybody. My role is really to take all the credit in this study. The person who actually does the real work in this study is the co-PI on the project, which is Alexi Potter. And so she and I co-manage the study. But in reality, even though, like I say, my primary job is to take all the credit and glory, it's Alexi who does all the work. And you're going to see that because we've divvied up the presentation tonight. So I'm sorry for like the multiple rounds of introductions, but it's actually Alexi who's going to start us off here, and she's going to give you the whole big background to the study. My job is to sit there and look, what did you say I was? Soothing or something, lilting. But so what I really want to do is, again, this study could not work at all without the huge involvement of Professor Alexi Potter. So please.
All right, well, I want to give a real thank you to Dr. Boucher and to Dr. Galbraith for coming to introduce us tonight. It's really wonderful for them to have given some time to set the stage for our study. So tonight's talk, we're going to do a few things. I can't see the screen and I can't see this. Okay. We're going to talk to you about the adolescent brain cognitive development study. So give you a little background about what is the study. And actually, who do you know? Sorry.
Keep talking.
All right, I'll just stand to the side and talk loudly. Oops. All right. It's okay. Let's just go to the next slide.
Okay.
there was the outline, which I couldn't read, but I'm sure that you could read about what we're going to take you through tonight. The idea that we had, though, was to tell you about the study, how the study came to be, and what's our approach to studying adolescent development, and how is this study poised to try to provide information. So the ABCD study stands for the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And as you've heard, it's a longitudinal study, means it's designed to go on for 10 years. It's really unprecedented in scope. We should have about 11,500 children enrolled at the end of the study, and we're closing enrollment at the end of September. So all of the people, the young people wearing ABCD t-shirts are not sleeping. They are just working all the time on getting the study going. And it's designed to answer some real fundamental questions. So trying to understand what are the influences of some of the things that happen between the ages of 10 and 20. What are the influences of nutrition and sleep, playing video games, playing sports, having accidents, and trying to decide to figure out, are there patterns of development that we can identify? Who are kids who go on to have good outcomes? Who are kids who may stumble along the way? Who are our kids who are late bloomers? Who are our kids who are the kind of early bloomers and then maybe have patches where they struggle? And seeing, can we help understand what these trajectories are? Are they related to your brain, to your genetics, to your biology, to your environment, to your school, and all of those things? So the study, the origins of the study came from Dr. Nora Volkow, and there's a picture of Dr. Volkow holding the brain up there. She's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and she really was the visionary behind the study, who really gathered all the support within the National Institute of Health and beyond to really kind of plant a flag on the idea of adolescent development. And she insisted on a few things, that the study started when kids were 10, so that they would be naive of substances and having had, still in childhood, not many in puberty yet, so we can really look at the interacting effects of these things on development. And I put this picture here just so you can see physically how different kids are from the age to 10 to 20. They change from, children into adults. And in a recent paper that Dr. Volkow published talking about the ABCD study, she concluded the paper by saying, thus, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study was created to answer the most pressing public health questions of our day. So really very big ambitions for the study. And while we know that adolescence is this, time of tremendous development for kids, I would argue that it's not only the kids who are undergoing tremendous development. Adolescence is a period of time between the ages of 12 and 17 when parents age considerably as well. And we are studying that. We're interested in parents' experiences, in parents' cognition, in parents' behaviors, and the factors that influence parents as well. This study is done with a huge collaboration at the federal level. So these are all different federal agencies who have contributed funding to the study, and all of who have a different slant on things they're interested in. And it's really made for this very multidisciplinary, rich study. So while Dr. Volkow was from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and was very interested in trajectories related to drug abuse and related to legalization of marijuana laws, the National Institute of Child Development was one of the first people who came in and shifted the entire study to really also capture very broadly normal childhood development. And it became much less a study about any one liability that can happen and much more a broad study about adolescent and child development. This was a competitive grant process, so the way it worked is that they put out a call for applications, and scientists around the country formed kind of consortiums, formed teams of people to put in applications to do the study. We went in a consortium that was based out of the University of California at San Diego. And the thing that's really special about that is, as scientists, we weren't given a study to do by Dr. Volkow. We got to propose the study we would want to do to answer those questions. And so throughout this process, we've had, really unprecedented opportunity to add things to the study to make it better, to guide how the science goes. And really the entire process is an incredibly collaborative one. And here we all are at the very first first ABCD annual meeting, about to embark on this project with no idea what we were really getting into. ABCD has 20 sites around the country. Here's where we are located. And the other thing I just want to say before I hand this off to Hugh for a few moments is that ABCD is committed to an open science model. And this is something that I think is going to really fundamentally change how we do science and how we get information. The open science model means that all of the data is shared, and it's all shared in very quick time. So in the old model, as scientists, you do a study and you kind of hold on to your data and you want to know what all the answers are, and then you let a little bit out in a publication or you give a talk on it. In this way, everybody can go in. If you're at a scientific institution, you can go in and download all of the data that I can download. So you can see everything in real time. People have full rights and are actually very encouraged to analyze and publish this data. And we joke, but I think it's true that the biggest, first papers from the ABCD study are likely to come from outside of the consortium, because we are all putting a lot of time and effort into trying to run the study and collecting data, yet the data is going out. So it's a really exciting thing. I think it's going to really show us things we never would have found if we just kind of kept to our narrow ideas of things. So I'm really excited to see where this will all take us. So I'm going to let Hugh talk you through the next section here.
So you might have figured out we're trying to a tag team on this, and I'm going to make one more effort to see if I can get this in a way that, fingers crossed. Well, that didn't work. Okay. So this is a multi-site study, as was mentioned, so 21 sites. I should, by the way, say, just first and foremost, thank you all so very, very much for coming tonight. We really, really appreciate it. It's 21 sites, so there's lots of differences amongst the 21 sites. And I guess we should maybe start off with what are the most obvious differences. You might have seen on the map we have from San Diego to Florida to Oregon to ourselves. We're the darkest of all the sites. We don't see the sun very much here. Here are our colleagues in San Diego over there, and we're all the way, if you're having trouble seeing, we're over here on the left. And it's not just that it's darker here, it's also colder. So we have Florida over here, and all the way, even colder than Minnesota, would you believe, is us. What sort of impact this might have on our developing kids is actually an interesting question. So we will address this. Just to give you a sense of the format of tonight, a little bit of background as to how the study works. So we started that, I'll give you a little bit more. And then we're going to present you just some preliminary results. And of course, this is very preliminary. We're still recruiting the sample. And if we set it up there, we've 9,600 recruited, so we're very close to our first 10,000. So, and as Alexei mentioned, we don't have much time to actually work with the data ourselves, but we will do what we can to kind of give you a flavor for it and to give you a sense of the sort of questions we're asking. And then also at the end to take as many questions as you might have yourselves about the study. Okay, so here's where we're recruiting from. So the basic idea is to go through the schools to get school involvement. It's a great way to reach out to all the kids in the nation, essentially, or in our catchment areas. We kind of define the local area where we want to recruit from. These are all the schools. These are the schools, so hopefully your school is represented up there. So we're recruiting from 39 Vermont schools, and so the range of about 1 to 27 students per school. And this is important to know. We were chatting about this earlier. We have far and away the greatest level of involvement than any of the other sites in the nation. Which is really incredible, because we were, as we were saying earlier, we were very stressed when this study started, because of course you write a grant and you say, well, we'll deal with the actual pragmatics when it happens. And our goal was to recruit 550 9 and 10 Vermont kids, which is pretty much all of them. It was anxiety-inducing, but it has worked, and it has worked again because of really a huge level of support from the department, from superintendents, from principals, from school teachers, from the families, as evidenced by so many of you being here. So it's really, really terrific. We've also managed to impress my daughter, which is no mean feat, a 15-year-old, with all the horribleness that implies. So the Vermont school education is really on top of it. So as part of her school curriculum on substance abuse, she got asked this question, and she texted me and couldn't hide her excitement. She said, "Dad, is this your study?" And I said, "Yes." I mean, it lasted like 5 seconds, and then she moved back to being herself. I shouldn't. I'm doing a study on adolescents. I shouldn't say nasty things about adolescents, should I? Maybe not. So how's it going? Our goal is to get a sample that broadly represents the US population. So this is a really important endeavor. We take this actually really seriously. It's made for a lot of work. As you probably know, I mean, far too many studies are done on white individuals, and a lot of it even on white males. So we really made a huge effort to reach out to ensure that we have a sample that's largely representative in terms of gender, socioeconomic status, urbanicity, race and ethnicity. How's it going? You know, pretty good. The sample, this is sort of nationwide, is, you know, more or less 50-50, slight preponderance of males versus females. We spend a lot of time trying to get the race and ethnicity. So, you know, basically the inner circle are our targets, the outer circle are the race and ethnicity of the individuals we've recruited. You know, some slight under-recruitment still of African Americans and Asians. But, you know, we're doing a lot of efforts over the summer months to try to correct that. So we're making, I think we're making pretty good progress because, you know, we want to be able to say things about, you know, the US adolescents. So, of course, we want it to be representative of the demographics. Socioeconomic status is difficult. This is always a challenge in these studies. This study is doing reasonably well, but as you can see, just to kind of explain this slide, this is sort of our recruitment targets. This is the American Community Survey, and then this is the demographics of the sample that we're recruiting. So you can see they're slightly skewing towards higher income families than lower income families. That is a little bit even more pronounced when it comes to parental education levels. Maybe it's just because of the nature of the study, but we are appealing to and getting more interest from better educated families. So like I say, we are making efforts over the summer months to try to address that. And there are all sorts of statistical approaches we can do to correct it after the fact if needs be. But at the moment, you know, our challenge, so if you are involved in this study, if you're a teacher, you know, our recruitment is ongoing, and you know, we want to get as diverse a sample as possible. So anyway, you can help us out with that would be great. There are actually flyers distributed all around. If you want to take them with you and hand them out to people, that would be fantastic. Okay, what can we say? I thought just a couple of slides to just start a little bit in on the data. I'm going to figure this out eventually to get this the right size so we're not craning our necks for the entire thing. But you know, as will be mentioned later, we are getting, as the parents here know, it's about 7 or 8 hours of assessment, so there's an awful lot of information. But I thought this is kind of an interesting one to put up in light of all the, you know, horrendous things that, you know, that get media attention that happen in schools. You know, the vast majority of the kids feel safe in school. So essentially they're either giving an emphatic yes or a no or an emphatic no. So that's good. Now again, it's interesting because, you know, there are a certain number, you know, who don't feel safe at school. And so it's roughly about 5%, and that's true for the nation as a whole, and also for even here in Vermont. And again, this is the beauty of having such a large sample. So with 12,000 kids, that's about 600 who don't feel safe at school. So that's going to be an interesting group to study, to see what's going on there. Again, though, for the most part, you know, quite positive. I get along with my teacher. Again, definitely leading towards the positive. And then just last example, you know, are there opportunities to engage in sports, clubs, or other school activities? And this was alluded to earlier. We know, kinda, that sports and activities and art and education and you know, mindfulness and all those things that happen in schools are important. But do we really know it? Do we have it properly quantified? Right? So as you know, with you know, budget cuts, it's a lot of those things that get cut, and a lot of teachers react very negatively and say, well, this is really bad. You know, the mindfulness, just to pick an example, this is really important for the kids. And our hope here is to be able to provide some kind of good quantitative data to show, you know, yes, indeed it is. Because one of the beauty of recruiting from the schools, and this is maybe just to appeal to the teachers, we can do an analysis on the curricula of the schools. So we can sort schools by whether or not there is physical education or art or dance or mindfulness and what have you. And then we can go and we can look at this rich data set that we have in the kids to see to what extent does that affect their development. And then ideally be able to quantify it, right? You know, so to what extent is, you know, how does art classes versus mindfulness versus dance benefit the developing child, or are they equal or are they different? These are the sort of kind of important questions that we can ask that will hopefully be able to then speak towards policy in education. Okay, so now we're going to go through some of the measures to give you a first feel of what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and what we're finding. to make this big.
No, I found my glasses.
Oh.
All right, these on this should work a little better then. So what are we measuring? Here's a quick view for you. I won't ask you to read it all because you won't, but we are measuring, this is just to show you, we are measuring a lot of things. And we are measuring a lot of things in many different domains. And we have over 4,000, close to 4,500 variables from every single kid. And that's not counting the millions of variables we have in terms of brain function and genetics as well. So we are measuring a lot of different things, and yet there's also ongoing discussion always within the consortium of what are we gonna measure and how? And I'll tell you, so the baseline battery right now takes about 7 hours for a family. The baseline battery that we proposed would have taken about 11.5 hours to complete when all of us got to have our, what we most wanted. And so then there was a real process of winnowing down. And the way this works is every different domain in the study has a work group assigned, and we are able to get, the national leading experts in children's mental health, in substance use, in culture and environment, and have these people lead the efforts of our team to decide exactly which measures we should use and how. And we decided on a few kind of guiding principles for us. All the instruments we have good psychometric properties, and what that means is that they're reliable and they're valid. They're measures that have been shown to really measure what they're trying to measure. All of the measures that we've chosen are measures that can scale throughout adolescence. So we can use the same thing or a version of the same thing when they're 10, when they're 15, when they're 20, so we'll be able to really have comparable data longitudinally. Every measure we've selected is related in some way to different adolescent outcomes, so something that's going to help us differentiate how kids do. All of them are sensitive to developmental changes over time. And maybe most important, when we are uncertain, we always pick the most efficient measure. So how can we do things as quickly as possible to try to reduce the burden of our families? We are already asking an incredible amount from them. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a demonstration right now as we talk about neurocognition. So one of the things we measure is cognition. And I'm going to ask Naomi to come up and join me here as we are going to ask you to play along and take a working memory test with us. This test is from the list sorting test, and it measures working memory. And Naomi's job is going to be to read you all of the items that come up. Normally we have the iPads do that, and we weren't able to have the computer do that. So here, come on over so you can get to the microphone. So the instructions for the task are, let me tell you, so you're going to see pictures on the screen. After each, I can't read this.
I can read it. I can read it from this.
Thank you.
After each set of pictures, you will see a blank screen. When you see the blank screen, I want you to tell me the names of the pictures in size order from smallest to biggest. For example, if I show you a motorcycle, a bus, and a car, you would say motorcycle, car, bus.
And you just reminded me, which is good, this is the exact version that the kids do. So what we're giving you is something that your 10-year-olds all do and do well on. So this is, are you as good as your 10-year-olds? Here we go, we'll find out. All right, ready now?
Horse, dog.
So there's, everybody got this one? Should have said dog, horse, right? We're putting them in order from smallest to largest. Are you ready for your next set? Everybody ready? Here you go.
Pumpkin, strawberry, banana.
Strawberry, banana, pumpkin. Excellent. Ready for the next set? Here we go.
Dog, frog, elephant, butterfly, rabbit, tiger, camel.
The kids really do this. The first time I took this, I thought the test was broken, and I stopped and said, well, that's clearly no human can do that, but indeed the 10-year-olds can do this. Correct order for anyone with very good working memory here is there on the screen. And just when you think that we're taxing your brain about as hard as we can, there's one final twist that we have the kids do. So this time you're going to get a list of words that's a mixture of animals and food. And I want you to give the words back to me. First, the food in size order, and then the animals in size order. Does everyone understand what we're doing? All right, here you go.
Strawberry, tiger, rabbit, blueberry, elephant.
Yeah, blueberry, strawberry, rabbit, tiger, elephant. Excellent. And so, thank you very much, Naomi. So these are all, yeah, very nice, right? It's amazing to me. I find it so very difficult, and kids really are, you know, they vary on their performance. That's the graph on the bottom. But what working memory is what you all just did, is taking information temporarily into your mind, being able to manipulate and use it for something else. And we know that there's a particular network of your brain that we use for that. Here's a little bit of a picture of it here. So first thing to notice is you use a lot of your brain when you're doing this kind of thing. And the particular areas in the frontal and parietal areas of your brain are active when you're doing working memory. And in a little while later, Hugh's going to show you more specific areas of the brain that are associated with that and how that works. But all of your brains were just looking like this as we did that task. That is what you were doing. And one of the things that we are really excited about in the study, and I think is a kind of theme you'll hear tonight, is the graph on the bottom is people's performance, okay? So what we see is what looks to me like a really nice normal distribution. Most of the people are kind of in the middle of the graph. A few people are very good at the task. A few people really struggle with the task. And for a study such as ABCD, that's a really wonderful property because it lets us look for differences in the brain that may relate to differences in these performance. And that's our, you know, kind of the hope of how we will understand individual differences in these kids as they go from children to adolescents. Now we're going to let Hugh do brain function.
Sounds like a bad joke. Hugh do brain function. Hugh can barely do computer monitor. So the goal here, and it's a perfect segue, is really looking at individual differences. I mean, and this has been mentioned, but we're doing this study in this longitudinal way, starting off with these 9 and 10-year-olds, because we want to be able, in time, once we have 10 years of data, to figure out the different trajectories and then figure out what might be the causes or risk factors for good outcomes, bad outcomes, and then what might be the consequences of those good or bad outcomes, how it might change the brain. But you see one 9-year-old brain and you've seen them all. I just picked this one as an example, C.P. Smith. I don't know if there are any parents here from C.P. Smith. So your kid is up there somewhere.
Each brain is a different kid.
Yeah, I should have mentioned if you're watching the slideshow. So again, thanks to our teams, to Bader primarily, who did all the stripping of the skull. So of course I'm wrong. I mean, you've seen one brain, you haven't seen them all. That's the interesting question. Like, it's kind of the fascinating science question. If you look at this, I don't know if I can make this work, but hopefully you can orient yourself. So this is a brain. So if the eyes were there, this is, imagine my brain. How does one pose for a photo? You sort of turn sideways. I suppose you put your head up, but here the head is kind of pointed down. So you can imagine you're looking at the brain that way. So this is the right hemisphere, that's the left hemisphere. Your eyes would be there. That's the back of your head. And you can see certain features. But if you look carefully at this brain and you compare it to this brain, and if you look carefully, you see they're actually not identical. You pick any two brains here and you start to look really closely, you say, actually there's a subtle difference in the shapes and the folds and the patterns. And we can quantify that. We can take a picture of your brain like that. We can remove what for us is all the uninteresting stuff, the skull, the neck, because really it's hair up that primarily interests us. You can then, measure it. You can trace it. We can trace along the outside of the brain, the inside. So really, what you're interested in, for the most part, is the grey matter. So, all of what you are. Maybe this is brutally obvious, but it's worth saying. All of what you are, your knowledge, your thoughts, your political persuasions, whether you're hungry right now or not, whether you're uncomfortable, it's all happening up here. It's all stored within that pretty thin 4 or 5 millimeter sheath of cortex, that grey matter that goes around your brain, and we can measure it. We can measure the white matter. So that's, the white matter underneath, that's the wiring that connects all these different brain regions together. And we can quantify it. So we can literally measure how thick, your cortex is. And with that, we can do interesting things. And if this sounds familiar, I mean, it is. This is modern-day phrenology. Phrenology was a great idea. They just made one mistake, which is that thinking that your skull would tell you something about the shape of your brain. It doesn't, but your brain tells you something about your brain, tells you something about your behavior. So we can quantify this. We can then do interesting things. You might have heard, this has kind of become quite common knowledge now, that in the adolescent, those kind of reward, pleasure-seeking centers mature before those prefrontal top-down regulation control centers. Have you heard this notion? So this is probably true. And that's what's being shown here. This is just, development over the, from childhood to adolescence. And you see that the last brain regions to develop are these kind of prefrontal regions, the sort of regions that we just saw for working memory. But this is what's involved in controlling. And those of you who have teenagers know all about this. I mean, they can experience pleasure and rage, and more rage, as much as the next person. But can they experience control? Can they control it? And again, it's a maturational process, and that's what we're trying to understand. And maybe the rate of that development might be consequential for maybe risk factors for anxiety disorders or depression, or maybe might be really important for resilience and good, successful outcomes. This is what we want to get at. I won't belabor this too much, but we can do research quantifying this. We can measure, this is in another study, but we looked at a group of 14-year-olds. Who varied in just puberty, so in their developments, but they're all 14. And some of them are more advanced in puberty, and some of them are less advanced, and the brain, is developing, with puberty. And, you can do things like we can measure, so the nucleus accumbens, so this is kind of a pleasure reward center in the center of your head. This is the, in another language, this is the little id in your brain. This is the gimme, 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 I want it. And then you have this, prefrontal systems that try to regulate those emotions. And they develop over time, and the prefrontal is a little bit slower catching up to the reward centers. The ratio between the development of those two, we can measure that with risk-taking. So the extent to which your prefrontal has caught up with that, reward center, that ratio is correlated with how much you gamble on a gambling task. So we can get these probes of these interesting behaviors. And of course, for adolescents, this is really important. Kids are developing, exploring, maybe engaging in risky behaviors. Can we understand what might be some of the neurobiology underlying that? This is some of the activations. So these are from the kids who are in the study. This is about 2,000 kids. This is that working memory task that Alexi referred to. Again, you can see, this is the back of the head, so that's visual cortex, this is parietal cortex, this is frontal cortex involved in, the parietal is involved in attention, the prefrontal cortex involved in those working memory processes. This is just another way of showing your brain. We sort of inflate it so that we can see all the activations on the surface. But the real point here to make is, there are individual differences. So Alexi showed that nice distribution. So, kids are not all the same, even on this sort of cognitive task. They perform differently, and we can see that reflected in how their brain functions. So the amount of activity in these key brain regions is related to how well you do in the task. So we can quantify this, we can understand those individual differences. We can look at these cognitive abilities, we can also look at reward. So this is a task where you had to sort of anticipate winning a reward. Okay, if I do well on this task, I'm going to make money, so the kids get excited, I'm going to win a win, and then you hit the button as fast as you can, and you either win or you don't. And all the while you're doing this, we're measuring your brain. So the parts of your brain that are lighting up as you're anticipating a reward, there's another part of your brain that lights up if you get the reward. People differ in the level of activity that they show. Is that important? Probably. This is going to be really interesting. What sort of differences in how you process rewards at 9 years of age, will that tell us anything about your trajectory through adolescence and the sort of behaviors you engage in to get rewards? And again, to what extent can all this be modified by all those important things? Good sleep, good exercise, good nutrition. This is just a measure, again, this is there's thousands of questionnaires, thousands of questions we could pull from. I just identified a couple of these just to share with you. This is fun seeking, and it's over there. I often act on the spur of the moment. So, we say that kids are impulsive, but again, there's a lot of variation, right? And that's really the point here. There's a big broad range of variation in just how thrill-seeking, fun-seeking kids are. I mean, this from your own observations of kids, but we can quantify this. We can relate this to brain. We might be able to relate this to genetics. We might be able to relate this to the home, to environment. We might be able to see what sort of trajectory this puts the kids on. We can look at anxiety. This is interesting because people often talk about things like sex differences. So you'll see here, the blue is the distribution of the boys and the orange is the distribution of the girls. And you can see there's a slight shift in the distribution. So the girls are scoring slightly more on the higher end than the lower end. But there's much, much more variation within a sex than there is between the sexes. Right? There's maybe this is a very obvious point, but there's a lot of variation amongst these kids in how they're responding and how they behave and how their brain functions. A couple more quick examples. Reward responsiveness. When I get something I want, I feel excited and energized. I wonder, is that going to prove to be predictive of how they behave when they're 13, 14, 15, 16, 17? I wonder how that might change and how the brain correlates of that might change as they engage in miscellaneous behaviors. And finally, drive. I go out of my way to get what I want. Again, just making the point again, there's a lot of variation. It's going to be really interesting to see what the trajectories are for these kids. The last thing I want to share with you, and this is a sort of ongoing research that we've just started, we can also look at variation in their brains, right? So I won't belabor the details, but basically we can look at these tasks that we have the kids do. So either this task that's involving working memory, or a task that's involving impulse control, or a task that's involving reward processing. And we can say, okay, just based on the brain alone, don't tell me anything about their socio-demographics or their environment, their genetics, but just look at the patterns of brain activity. There are differences. So some people group together. There's a kind of, in most of these groups, let's say the working memory task that we were talking about, most kids look similar in terms of brain function, but then there's kids who look different. And then there's even fewer kids who look different. So there's a bunch of different groupings of just how kids present and how they use their brain to perform these tasks. Again, we have no idea if this is going to prove meaningful, but it's going to be, we think, fascinating to follow these groups and say, okay, how it was that you, in your group of people who all looked alike, processed rewards at 9 and 10, is that going to be related to what sort of anxiety disorders you might develop, what sort of substance use issues you might develop, or how much drive and academic success you might have? We don't know, but that's the purpose of the study. This is me. Yes, almost done. So, I will have a broken neck by the time we're done. We were kind of curious, so as I mentioned, it's dark and it's cold here. So are our kids watching more TV? That would seem reasonable. When we talk to parents about this study, this is one of the first things they ask about, screen time, mobile phones, right? What sort of impact does that have on kids? This is a big hot issue. Are smartphones addictive in some meaningful way? Again, there's a lot of variation in the amount of hours that kids are spending watching TV. Curiously, our kids are, very much on the low end, right? Why that is, we're not sure. But again, the point is there's a lot of variation here. And we're trying to do a good job of assessing not just how many hours do you spend, but what's the content of what they're watching. This is the average amount of sleep. So sleep is critical, we know this. There's again distribution across our sites. I think the next slide quantifies it. So the recommendation for kids in this age is 9 to 11 hours of sleep. You'll see that, this is the Vermont in dark and the national average. 50% of the national average, about 70% of our, again, maybe this is because it's dark and cold. Our kids, this seems reasonable, they sleep more. But again, we know, and you know this as parents, sleep is critical, and the neurobiological consequences of not having enough sleep are becoming very well understood. We have a sizable number of kids who get 8 to 9 hours, 7 to 8 hours, 5 to 7, less than 5 hours. So what does that do? And if you can imagine kind of a risk profile. If you have not a lot of sleep and let's say poor nutrition, you don't get as much exercise, how does that affect your developing brain? Or, put it another way, to what extent is potentially a detrimental effect of poor sleep attenuated by getting lots of exercise? Right? This is the question again, how do we quantify what these miscellaneous influences are? Again, these are the sorts of questions that we hope to be able to address with this study. Almost done with this piece, so we can look at activity, like what are our kids doing? I can't look at it there, but I can look at it here. There's a sizable number of kids who are getting no activity at all, or less than an hour, or more than 5 hours. This is the Vermont average. This is the national average. Our kids are doing quite well. So we're quantifying this. We also have very good quantification of what sorts of activities. Is it aerobic exercise? Is it extracurricular activity? Is it reading? We have all of this quantified in the kids. So we'll be able to, again, assess this and see what sort of impact this has.
All right, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with all the things we measure, huh? So I'm going to take you through the last bit of domains that we're measuring and some of the preliminary findings that we're seeing. And talk a little bit about mental health in families. And you can see that we measure a lot of different variables, and we measure them in a lot of different ways. So we're asking children about themselves. We're asking parents to report on their children and also to report on themselves and their family and on the family history. And we're asking teachers to report on the kids' behavior at school. And so we're really using this idea of getting multi-informant, that if you get data from more places, you're more likely to kind of hone in on the reality that's there. And also there may be important differences. Kids may act different at school, and that may be related to other important outcomes as well. How do we measure families? There are a lot of different ways to measure families, and in our study there's a work group for culture and environment, and we're interested in factors that are more broadly related to cultural affiliation, biculturalism, religious practices, spirituality, those things in the home, how much a part of their lives those things are. We're interested in neighborhood effects, and these have been shown to be really big effects on a lot of different types of outcomes, particularly for adults and for adult health. And so we're measuring this in kids as well, neighborhood safety, crime rates, those kinds of things. And then also looking directly at family environment, relationships between the kids and their parents, relationships within the family in a larger way, amount of time that they spend together, types of things they enjoy doing. Those types of things we're all measuring when we study families. But let's start and look at diagnoses here. So these are mental illness. Let me see if I can figure out how to make this work. There we go. Okay, so these are percentages here on the y-axis, and so you can see that the rate of these mental illnesses is generally pretty low in our sample at 9 and 10. We have about an 8% rate of ADHD, which is in line with the national average for this age that we'd expect, and also some oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, also in line with what we would expect. And these are kind of acting out disorders, right? So kids who are not listening and defiant, but to a level that reaches a clinical threshold. So we are seeing, it's this epidemiological sample, and we're seeing about what we would expect with a random sample, which is good. But I think it's important to make the point that when we talk about mental illness, one of the things we're really seeing is that the vast majority of kids have no mental health diagnosis at 9 and 10. Most of these kids are healthy and functioning well. And so when you put it in perspective where you can see the no diagnoses, you can see that the other bars start to look much, much smaller. And to me, this kind of represents a little better the state of mental health within our country. So how do we measure families? What are we doing to measure family functioning? And so on this graph, what I'm showing here is this is perceived parental acceptance. So this is kids answering the question, how much do you feel like your parent is accepting? So down here is kids who feel like their parent is somewhat warm and accepting, all the way up to very warm and accepting. And I'm showing you here the relationship between parental acceptance and those externalizing problems. So here's low, moderately high, and high rates of externalizing behavior. And what we see is a relationship. Kids who have more problems with externalizing behavior report lower parental acceptance. And it's important to know this is one point of time, and this is what we know as a correlation. So we see both of these things. You cannot say that poor parental acceptance causes externalizing problems. You also can't say that externalizing problems cause your parent not to accept you. All we can say is that we observe these things, that they change together, that we see this pattern in the data. And it lets us ask other questions and try to understand what things might affect these. And so one of the things that I was interested in looking at is family history of mental illness. And this graph here, I'm showing you family history of depression. And what this is here is the number of family members, and this is siblings, parents and grandparents who have a diagnosis of depression. And you'll see that we have many kids who have none, but we have up to a significant number of kids who have 5 or 6 family members who have major depression, and that they carry this, we would assume, this vulnerability. We know that depression runs in families, so that there are kids who are more vulnerable to things like depression than others. And yet, I think it's really important to say that none of this is deterministic. And so what this is showing you, it's a little bit of a complicated graph. Let me walk you through it. This is showing you externalizing here. So higher scores here are more problems with those acting out behaviors. Lower scores are fewer problems. And the different lines are all the family history of depression. So here you'll see the different colors by how many direct family members have depression. So up here at the highest are these kids with 6 family members with depression have higher externalizing scores. But if you look at the relationship, what I'm showing you is the relationship across scores of parental acceptance. So in families where there is low parental acceptance, the family history of depression shows a real relationship with this variability in scores. But if you are a family with high parental acceptance, it completely ameliorates that. It is a completely no difference between any of that familial risk. And so, you know, to me, these are the kinds of things that are so much more interesting and hopeful. What are the things that we can change? Parents can change how they parent. We can do work to be more accepting, to make sure our kids know that we are accepting when they don't. And this kind of data suggests that that could be really important as a kind of buffering and a protective factor for kids who have this risk factor with a strong family history of depression. So these are the kinds of things that, you know, I wish we had all day to play in the data and look at things like this. There's such a rich data set and so many relationships that we can find. And I do think it's appropriate to say right now that the majority of these data slides that we showed you, in fact, I would say perhaps all of the data slides that we showed you were prepared by our research staff. So we've had a really great time in the last month asking people to work with us, to look at these things with us, and to you know, figure out how do we look at these relationships and what kind of patterns are we seeing. And so a huge thank you to all of the people who have created all of these graphs for us tonight. And that brings us to the end of our talk. So just want to give a big acknowledgement to all of the parents and kids who are in our study. None of this data would be possible without you. A real thanks again to the Agency of Education, who's been so supportive of the study from the very first email we sent out saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this in Vermont. Are you willing to partner with us? And got the answer of course, yes. And to our university, who has really gone above and beyond to help provide us with the infrastructure we need to do the study. We're very lucky to have a clinical research center at our university. It's one we've had here for many years, decades, I would say. And that's where we see all our families, and it allows us to have protocol rooms that are exactly the same for every family. It's really an ideal space to do research, and it's staffed with nursing staff to help with some of the elements of the protocol, and that works well. We wouldn't be able to do any of these brain imaging without our MRI research center, and Richard Watts is here tonight. He's done a lot of this analyses of looking at some of these brain imaging and making protocols that we can implement across the whole consortium. And a real thanks to all my direct staff who are collecting this data every day and helping us to look at it. Did I forget anyone, Hugh? All right, so if you have questions, Hugh and I are happy to take them. I see a question there. Yep, so the question is, do we have kids in our study who are gender diverse, who have either an, kind of the word was ambiguous, but have a gender identity that doesn't conform to their sex assigned at birth, or who were born with intersex genitalia? And yes, we do. And I didn't plant the question, but I actually am the work group leader for our gender identity and sexual health work group within ABCD, and we, yeah, you look surprised. No, we actually are finding very interesting data about that. We added a dimensional scale of gender, so we measure how much a kid feels masculine, how much a kid feels feminine for every child in the study, to try to get beyond, yes, kids are, male and female, they're broken up that way, but perhaps they are also in a dimensional way in terms of masculinity and femininity, and we're starting to look at that data and see pretty interesting things. And we'll have the first study to look at brain development and see if that relates to that or not. So yeah, something we're doing. And when we designed the study, one of the things we fought really hard for was to have very broad inclusion and exclusion criteria. So if you are a 9 or 10-year-old and you are able to complete the protocol elements, you are eligible for the study with very few exceptions. Things that are MRI contraindications would be an exception if you couldn't go in the scanner because of a medical condition, or if you had brain or abnormalities such that we can't analyze your brain data, you are excluded. But other than that, we want everybody. We want all types of kids in the study. Zoe, go ahead.
Oh God, this is a lot of people. I was wondering about the graph that you showed us. So was that saying that families where more family members have depression, the kids are more likely to have problems in school or are more likely to have depression?
What I showed there, so the question was the graph I showed saying that family history of depression made you more likely to have problems in school or more likely to have depression. And what I showed there was more likely to have acting out behavior. It actually is true for having depression as well. I didn't show that graph because I had shown other graphs about acting out. I just stayed with that. And it's not just at school. So it's acting out behavior anywhere. Kids who break rules a lot, kids who are hyperactive, who interrupt, up to the point where they have trouble with their friends because of it. Those types of problems are related to a family history of depression. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So those were questions, do we have any protocols or ways to protect people from doing things with the data we might not want them to do? And two, are we concerned that people might look at the data and draw conclusions that may not be supported or that might be premature? I'm actually going to ask you to chime in on this one. There you go.
So the questions about professional misconduct get directed to me. Okay. Fine. So the way we do it, so the data are publicly available, but with constraints. So they're actually available to the research community. So if somebody wants to access the data, they need to sign kind of a memorandum of understanding, a data use agreement, where they promise that they won't try to identify the data, because it's all de-identified, and they won't share the data. And then you need a university signatory to sign off on it. So that's what gives us a level of protection that people won't use the data in any kind of nefarious way because we know who has it. And then the data are all de-identified. So it's not the case that parents can log on and check up on their kid and find out what their kid reported. And in fact, this is an issue that comes up quite a lot. Because, you know, sometimes parents ask us, okay, so what's going on? You know, how are they scoring on these anxiety measures? And they're genuinely interested. And we tell them that we can't tell them. Because if we want to do the study properly, the kids have to trust us, and the parents have to trust us. So we tell the kids, whatever you tell us, we won't tell your parents, unless you're putting yourself in some imminent danger. You know, you're doing something that's very dangerous and we need an immediate intervention. Are you reporting suicidal thoughts or suicidal behaviors? But other than that, we will not share your information with your parents. And then the parents, we say the same thing. We won't share your impressions of your kids with your kids. And that's really the only way that we can get, you know, honest information. And if you think about this, this is a 10-year study. I mean, these kids are going to be 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and they're going to be engaging in behaviors that they won't want the police to know about, never mind their parents. So this kind of confidentiality is essential. So that risk of parents kind of logging on and seeing what's happening, that's all de-identified. That's not possible.
And then the other question about, are we concerned about scientists publishing things that we don't agree with or we don't like how they handled it? We are really hands-off with that. If you have gone through a university and you have the right to access the data, you can analyze anything you want and you can write it up. And I think just having some faith in the scientific process. If you go to publish it, it will go through peer review. And I think as a scientist, we believe that that will mean that things hopefully will get through that are well vetted. And the data isn't just thrown up there. We have a data analytics core who very carefully is curating the data to make sure that what goes up is accurate. Because if we put up inaccurate data, then that would be on us. So, and there'll be periodic, what they call patch releases to correct any errors that were found.
Were the schools that were chosen, were they randomly selected, or was it a convenience sample? And the comparison of the education of the adults in the study compared to the ACS, was that ACS for Chittenden County or for the United States?
Right. So one of my chores is responsible for the epidemiology. So the schools were very carefully chosen, in fact, to do this in an epidemiologically rigorous way. Without getting into too much details, I mean, we're constrained by where the research centres are. So it's not a truly representative sample, but be that as it may, just by happenstance, where the research centres fall, about a quarter of all the 9 and 10-year-olds in the nation were within our catchment areas. So what we did, but I'll quickly say that this doesn't necessarily apply to Vermont, and there's a reason why, but let's say a site like LA. They'd say, okay, we want to recruit from this area. There was an analysis done of all the socio-demographics of the schools, and then targets identified, and then so the schools that this site should recruit from are given to the site. And so they can't just go to, you know, well, I know this school over here, because that could introduce a bias. And then what we can do is we can monitor the sample as it accumulates. So those graphs that I showed you, we have pages of them being generated essentially in real time. And then what we can do, and it's quite clever really, and I say that because I didn't come up with it, is if we find that the sample is skewing, we're getting, let's say, not enough Hispanic families. What we can do then in the next release of schools is overrepresent schools that have a large Hispanic population so that we can kind of correct as we're going along. Now in Vermont, as it turns out, like I said, we need all of the 9 and 10-year-olds. We're essentially doing more a census than we are doing a random sampling because, you know, and there was a second half to your question that I've already forgotten. Oh, yeah, so the American Community Survey. Yeah, so it's not done, there isn't, so that's also a survey. It doesn't have sufficient information for our specific geography. So it's really, we have national samples. So the way it works is we kind of a national profile. Here's what we want to recruit. We do an analysis of all the sites. So given who is in their recruitment area, we set targets, and then we manage how the sites are doing compared to that overall average, and then trying to adjust within and between sites.
I have a question about what type of genetic testing or what targets you're going to be looking at.
Yeah, so the question is about the genetic testing. So there's a particular chip. So essentially, we are going to get, we hope actually to get whole genome sequencing. So every SNP will be tagged. Right now, it's sort of a sampling of the genes. It's about 600,000 or so genes that are sort of distributed across the genome, and then from that information we can impute what the genetics are for the whole genome. And so that information, again, we haven't talked about that much, but it's a really kind of fascinating question as well. We just talked about depression. So what causes depression, right? We know, as was mentioned, there's a heavy family influence. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's genetic, but it's probable that there's a large genetic component. We know that it's highly heritable. And again, what we can do with a study like this is we can hopefully quantify, how many parts genetics versus environment. The other thing I should mention with regards to the study is in there of the 12,000, there's 1,700 who are twins. So half of them are identical twins and half of them fraternal. So again, that gives us another great opportunity to try to disentangle genetic influences from environmental influences, because you get these really interesting discordances. You might have one twin who, let's just say, starts using cannabis at age 13, and the other twin who doesn't. And then it enables you to tease these influences apart.
And I think in terms of the genetics on individual kids, we are not doing any clinical genetic testing, so we're not collecting genetic information at that level. So that we're not doing that and giving that to families at this point in the study.
Okay, I just have another question. So you're saying that all this data is going to be available for all researchers. So do you worry about I know it seems more efficient for everyone to have the data, but do you feel like there's going to be people doing the same thing? Is there a way, when they have the data, okay, I'm going to be looking at this comparison versus, so people, 10 people aren't doing the same thing.
Yeah. So we were mandated to make the data available. So the NIH has put about $300 million into this project, and that's great for people who got the grant, and maybe not so great for everybody else. So one way to get around that is to say, okay, well, at least you don't have to collect the data, but you can have it. So we've thought about this, but we can't really police who's going to work on what, because if you think about it, these data will be available globally. So we'd have to have a sort of clearinghouse where you want to do an analysis, so you've got to submit it to us, we read it, we give you approval. What if you got two competing applications? Are they this similar, that different? What if somebody said, yeah, I want to do X, but then 5 years later hadn't done it? Do we release it? To try to, and is your proposal sufficiently different from this proposal? After a while, it just becomes impossible to please. So really the best way is just kind of an open. But what we find, because we have, there are these anxieties, this data set is, I think the technical word is ginormous. So that people are concerned about this, but in reality, people end up with very different interests. So people, and I say if we were to survey the room here and say, okay, and actually we might do this at some point, say, what do you think as a parent we should be measuring? What's the most interesting thing? You'd probably find about 100 different answers. And so it is with the research community. People actually tend to have quite different interests, and there's not as much overlap as one might fear. Okay.
And I'm not challenging outstanding professionals like yourself, so I know you have an answer for my question. I worry that we're already kind of a self-selected sample, and I think that was sort of borne out by the comparison about the education level of the parents. And I'm wondering about, in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, as I would assume inevitably the sample size gets a little smaller, how that might change the outcomes or change your data, because the kids who start may not all be there at the end? Just curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. How is that going to happen over time? I will say first, we're focused on the one thing that doesn't match the census. If you step back and look at the sample we've recruited thus far compared to any studies that have ever been done, we are much more representative. So I think that while we want it to be perfect, and we are spending our last 4 months doing everything we can to try to make those graphs match and to really make sure we're getting all of the families, I think that overall I'm pretty happy with how we have done. So I think that that's just, maybe I'm the glass half full and Hugh isn't. And then in terms of is that true? I don't know. Then in terms of, how is this going to happen over time? I think it's a really good point, and it makes sense that there are people for whom the study is more of a burden. If you have a more stressful life, it is harder to do the study. And one of the things we've done that I think is going to turn out to be super important is that you don't have to stop the study if you can't come in this visit. that over 10 years, if you're, we want you to come to every visit. We want to speak to you on the phone every 6 months. We want to see you every year, and we're going to do everything we can to make that happen. But if if you miss a visit in a year, we're going to call you 6 months later and welcome you to still be in the study. So hopefully that will help us to keep families in. And then we have, a really crackerjack team of statisticians who assure us that there are statistical ways they can help us to balance those differences out.
Yeah, just a small factoid. The reason why, I'm describing earlier how we identified the schools, based on their sociodemographics. One of the strengths of that is then we know the sociodemographics of the people who were invited to participate, because we have that analysis. And then we know the sociodemographics of the people who said yes. So we can quantify if there's a bias there. And then there are statistical ways that we can correct for it after the fact. But of course, it'd be much better to get a nice representative sample in the get-go. And across the sites, people are making extraordinary efforts to kind of, especially with, harder to reach. And I mean, as you well know, there are segments of the population who don't trust researchers. So there's a lot of time spent going to churches, to local communities, to disseminate the study, to get local influencers involved. But you're right, I mean, the issue you're referring is an absolutely correct one, and it's something that we will definitely try to quantify and correct for as best we can. I think what we're going to do, we're happy to take questions forever. Seriously, because this is what we do, we talk for a living. But I think Rich just wants to say a few words in closing, but then we'll come right back up here and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. I don't want to stop the questions, but it's getting late. I see people slipping away. I wanted to make 2 points. First of all, I want you all to thank our presenters once again and their teams for doing this. And most importantly, on behalf of the university, I want to thank the people who are participating in this study. It's an incredible amount of time and effort, and it's not an easy thing to do. And I really hope, to Lexi's point, that you will understand that we really need to keep this going, because the real fruits of the study come from repeating these observations again and again over time. So to the extent that you can possibly stay in this study, we and the nation would really be thankful and grateful to you as parents and as adolescents if you can keep this going so that we can get the most useful data out of it. So please carry on with your questions, and thank you for coming. I have to leave, but they can talk all night.
Like I said, we will keep going. People can either, as they're doing, leave, that's fine. People can ask questions, or if you want to, depending on the numbers, if you just want to come up and chat, that's also fine. Whatever you want. If anybody wants to put their hand up and ask a question, there we go.
If folks were to move from Vermont somewhere, I'm assuming the answer is yes, they could hopefully be near another place and jump on board there and keep going, or is that not true?
Yeah, we've had many families, unfortunately, or several families who have moved. And there's a few options. If you move into a place where there's a site that's nearby, that is an easy option. We also are committed to our families. So we have families who have moved away who we have already paid to fly back for their one-year visit. So if you'll do a 6-month phone call with us, and maybe you still have family and friends in Vermont you want to visit, we are more than happy to shoulder the expense of having your family come back to do the study. We also can do some visits remotely. We're working on kind of improving that technology. We have families who are, abroad for a year, so we're not going to fly them back. That doesn't make any sense at all. But we'll get everything that we can remotely, and we'll have them come back when they can come in. So yeah, and there have been, I would say probably 30 or 40 kids who have already switched sites. Families have moved.
I'm not planning on going anywhere. I'm just curious.
Oh, good.
But if you go abroad to like Italy, we come to you for the assessment. That's another important option.
So you collected this huge, broad spectrum of data to, measure your children and all the background effects of what could possibly be measuring, reflect in their brain scans. Do you continuously I mean, obviously that's a lot of data to collect. You can continuously check in on that data again and again, see if it's changed, because, I mean, just for example, with like the mental health in families, like some people aren't aware of like issues, so does that continually like crop up like once in a while? It's like, okay, every other 6 months, this like bit, has anything changed? Has the child's awareness changed? Has family circumstances, like socioeconomic stuff, is that taken in?
Those are absolutely really important questions. And the way we do that is every 6 months we have a phone contact with the family, and we are asking, the parents will tell you exactly that. Have you moved? Has your child switched school? Have you been to the hospital? Has anything happened? Is it, you know, anything that you want to report? And we do a check-in with the kids on their mood and behavior on just a few questions. And we see families every year. And at the visits every year, we do a real check-in on the data that we collected in the past to make sure that that's, have there been any changes or things that they've remembered, and then new data moving forward. And I'll say that I've also been really surprised we've had families contact us after the fact to say, you know what, I talked to so-and-so and actually the answer is this. And we have the capacity to make that note and go in and address that. So yeah, we're constantly trying to both check with what we have and make sure it's true and collect the new data on top.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we said that explicitly, but the brain imaging happens every 2 years. And actually what we're told, the kids we will have scans at roughly age 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. And the whole purpose is for there to be change, so that we can see those changes and we can see what influences them. So yes, we're doing exactly what you asked.
So, I'll go. So, thank you. It's really, really exciting. Have you and the team thought about sort of the secondary or third-party uses or users of the data? So you're screening from the research community to make sure the findings and the analysis is robust and rigorous. But that doesn't mean the interpretation of those findings and the policies, and given the vitriol of our society right now in terms of taking some of these findings and running with them in certain directions that none of us really want. On the flip side, the potential policy implications and the educational system reforms and the parenting evolution that could come from this is quite exciting. So do you have a policy advisory group or someone, and also a monitoring system to sort of track where the results of this work are going so that one can understand and fact check and correct and also balance things out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question on a couple of levels. So, for example, this hasn't happened yet to us, but it could. So colleagues of ours were involved in a similar study, which also made a big effort to ensure that you had good representation of races and ethnicities. And then unbeknownst to them, somebody grabbed the data and did an analysis comparing blacks against whites of their brains. And you can imagine where that went. So this is a big anxiety that people will inappropriately use the data. So what we're trying to do, there's a couple of things. We have a number of external advisory boards, independent scientists who are forever advising us on these sorts of issues. We will have a policy working group because we're well aware that people will be disappointed if our research doesn't actually guide policy. As I mentioned earlier, the education practices. We're in a great position. There's not a lot we can do about what, the research community, how they will analyze the data, other than, as Alexi mentioned, the peer review process, and that's just how things happen. But we are also having a practice where kind of the consortium will do consortium-led papers doing all the appropriate statistical analyses with all those methods, like fully published and detailed. And we're hoping that then that will carry with it a sort of stamp of approval. So these will be hopefully like the more definitive analyses. But the policy group, will definitely be established, and this is their goal.
They're also, in terms of what they do with the data, with the open science model, it really kind of cuts both ways. So anyone who publishes from ABCD data has to cite the version of data that they used. And the consortium is rolling out a data analysis online tool so that actually anybody can go redo their analysis and see exactly what they saw and then how they chose to present it. So that's really changing, and that new tool also has a place in it where you can do hypothesis registration. So say what you're looking for ahead of time, and those studies will carry more weight. If you actually knew what you wanted to find and then you found it, those should be, kind of taken taken a little more seriously. So I think they're building those kinds of things in. It's also a segue, which I'm going to take advantage of. Every site, including Vermont, is assembling a community liaison board. We have not constituted ours yet. So if anyone is interested in serving on a community liaison board, you should shoot an email to abcd@uvm.edu. We're looking for people who want to help guide and help direct us within our communities.
Also, this is just a small note, and again, maybe this is obvious, but I have to say, sometimes when we tell people that all the data are being made available, people are like, well, are you guys crazy? I mean, don't you want to keep it? We have to say, like, we love the idea. I mean, I think it's just it's a fascinating development in the democratization of science. So if you are competent, and you can get, some sort of university official so that you can get, sign off on it, you can do cutting edge research anywhere. So you can be in a disadvantaged, let's say a third world country, but if you have the smarts, you can have full access. And we think collectively that that's just a superb development. Yeah. I think there's one here, and then.
Thanks. I had a question about the data that you're gathering, because you went over the data domains and they seem pretty generic across basically all the children you have in your study. But while they're aging, they're probably developing more, or some of them might be developing diseases. I saw the NCI as one of the beta factors of the study. So you're changing your data domains or according to the patients, or sorry, I work with patients, the children.
Yeah, we're hoping to not necessarily change the domains, but to make sure the measures are appropriate within the domain. So we know we want to study family factors. But yeah, the questions we ask or the specific constructs we measure may be different at different ages within the kids. Was that your question?
More or less. So if you take an example where a kid developed cancer, do you then follow up with more data elements related to that domain?
Yeah, we are not doing that systematically. So that she was, saying, so like if there is a cancer diagnosis, we won't suddenly collect a lot more data on that. So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't, I don't think there are plans though to get medical records or any of that, right?
If we can, yeah.
There will? Okay.
If families will agree to it.
Okay, so maybe we will, but we won't change the protocol in response to that.
We also do have a working group that's working on just this, because what's appropriate for a 9 and 10-year-old obviously is not appropriate for an 18-year-old, and also the technology in 8 years will be very different. So we're anticipating that we would probably move much more to kind of smartphone technology, our mobile and wearable technologies. There's also so there's a group that's kind of designed to change the kind of nature of the assessments depending on what's appropriate, what's available. And also this study keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. There's all this other kind of new fascinating information that's becoming available to us. So, we spend a lot of time measuring, genes and brain and psychology. What about the environment? So we can cross-reference with, EPA information on noise, pollution, toxins. There's kind of geolocation information on, there's these analyses out there about, how many liquor stores are within a 3-block radius. So all that information we're trying to combine too. So the study is almost designed as well to be open to enable these additional data sources.
I think maybe we should wrap up and just do informal questions.
Okay, I think we've...
Was there still a question? Okay, yep, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have a question about trauma. I'm an educator at one of the schools that's in the study, and we've spent a lot of professional development time on building resilient learners and being trauma-informed at our schools. And I didn't see the word trauma anyways on your scope, and I'm wondering if that's a lens that you're looking at us with, or if you're communicating with schools about their work on traumatic experiences in kids.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yes, we definitely are measuring trauma. There's a lot of things I tried to kind of make those slides a little more manageable, but yep, we are. And every year we'll ask about different life events that may have happened that may fit that. I think the idea though of, we've been trying to figure out the best way to get information, more in-depth information from schools, and thinking about ways to, like, asking principals, what percentage of your teachers have done trauma-informed training and those types of things. And I think that'll be really rich data. And, there's so much happening all the time, but I think we're working on that. We're also working on ways to get, some of the physical characteristics of schools into how crowded is a classroom and those types of things that are really burning questions in education for how much those things mattered in which ways. So hopefully we'll be putting that together.
I don't think you can stop before you take a question from your sister. No?
Exactly.
Okay. Was there one more or not? Last one, maybe? Yeah. So maybe we'll wait for the mic to come to you if you have it. I would just say quickly, by the way, you mentioned a word that's important to mention, resilience. I mean, there's an awful emphasis, tends to be an emphasis in these sort of studies about, well, can we understand what goes wrong? You know, mental health, substance use. But I mean, it's just as possible that we can look at kind of, you know, positive psychology outcomes. I mean, a lot of kids with adversity and trauma do really well. So, I mean, could we figure that out? I mean, that would be maybe even more interesting than trying to characterize what goes wrong. But what builds a strong, robust, resilient kid? That's just, for us, just as important a question. So maybe last question, and then like we say, we'll just take questions up at the podium.
Hello.
Yeah, you're good.
So I was wondering, so in particular, since, as you mentioned, there is a hypothesis that the prefrontal cortex grows until 25 or 26. I'm wondering if there's any chance of extending the longitudinal study beyond 20.
Are you trying to get all the staff to quit en masse? No. No.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't even want to think about it now, but for sure. I mean, if we do a good job, we've got good retention, and we've got this rich data from kids 9 to 20, you know, we're going to be writing the grant to keep going thereafter. Because as you know, I mean, all sorts of interesting outcomes happen then in terms of, you know, careers, college, you know, lifestyle, you know, getting married, relationships, you know, chronic illnesses, diseases. So in again, like I said, we don't want to say this out too loud in front of, you know, the people who actually have to do the work. But I would anticipate that this study will go as long as we will.
We were guaranteed 10 years of funding when the NIH put together money for 10 years of funding to capture 10 to 20, and then we'll find out as we get there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
So again, a huge thank you to everyone for coming, and you know, feel free to stay around and chat if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you.